What's up, it's Rowan here from Art of Smart Education with another episode of the weekly HSC Eco Stats Update. Now in this episode, we're doing all things inflation because there's recent data from the CPI for the last quarter and it's really confusing. On one hand, it's gone up. On the other hand, it's gone down. Which one is it? Which one do you use? And how can you use it to analyze the effectiveness of monetary policy? We're going to dive into all of that in this episode. If this is your first time dialing in these episodes, in minutes, I summarize the main headlines from around the domestic and global economy every single week, giving you the key stats and analysis that you need to level up your economics results across the short answers and essays to unlock that Band 6. So let's look at the CPI data. Now, it's super confusing. We just got quarterly data, and on the face of it, okay, it shows that it's gone upwards. It shows that it went from 3.6% in the March quarter to 3.8% in the June quarter. Now, what's going on, right? Who knows, right? But we have seen over the monthly data that it has been going the wrong way. And deflation sort of ended in December. The monthly data was indicating it was going up. Now, remember though, monthly data has a lot of noise, okay? It can change a lot. It's not really a good long-term indicator. Equally, the annual CPI increase here is also not a great long-term indicator because it's going to factor in a lot of irregular or temporary price changes. And that's what the trimmed mean is designed to solve. Now, the trimmed mean basically takes the top 15% and the bottom 15% of price changes, gets rid of it. What's left, they take the mean, okay? And what that is meant to do is remove the effect of these sort of one-off temporary price changes so you get a much better underlying long-term measure of what the state of inflation is in the economy. Now, this has fallen, okay? This went from 4.1 in December quarter to 4% in the March quarter to 3.9% in the June quarter. So it's going the right way. Now, of course, it's still sticky. 4.1 to 3.9 over 6 months is not a big change, okay? Like, it's still really showing that there is a level of inflation that is sticky in the economy, but it is going the right way. Now, this is the data that the RBA looks at when they're measuring themselves the effectiveness of their cash rate changes, right? They don't look at the monthly data because it doesn't give them a good long-term sense, because ultimately, monetary policy has a 6 to 12 month time lag. If they use monthly data, they're going to be making highly distorted decisions that are really prioritizing the here and now rather than looking at the fact that their changes that they make in the cash rate will take time to flow through the transmission mechanism and through into the economy. So this is really positive, okay? And we can see this here. We can see that, yes, right, the trim mean was dropping. And it has continued to drop. It has slowed. So what you want to highlight is that actually monetary policy is proving to be effective. They always said they were needing to really walk a very fine line between placing downward pressure on inflation, without also causing a recession, right? And causing too much economic pain. Yes, they've seen some impacts on employment. We'll certainly look a little bit more at that as we look at the analysis in the conflict on objectives here. But ultimately, you can use this data to look at and really say that monetary policy, yes, it's creating pain, but it is proving to be effective in continuing to place downward pressure on inflation in the economy. Now, let's look at a couple of other headlines that use this data and have some really great insight. And the first is from Greg Jericho at The Guardian. And if you're not coming and looking at any of Greg Jericho's work at The Guardian, I highly recommend it. He does some great work with data. Now, his question is, well, inflation, if we just look at all CPI inflation, right, not the trimmed mean, it's still going up. It went from 3.6 to 3.8. Why, right? Is it excess demand? Because really, cash rate increases are designed at dealing with demand pull, right? It's an aggregate demand policy, it's macroeconomic, and so therefore, what further cash rate increases could help with is if there is excess demand that's continuing to drive that inflationary pressure. And one of the best things that you can look at here is the retail trade figures. And so that's basically how much we're spending, okay? If we're spending lots and more than we have in the past, that shows, okay, excess demand is driving inflation and further cash rate increases are warranted because we still have not yet captured that excess demand. And what he shows here is, I think, just in a visual, a really powerful sort of sense that no, okay, we're spending, way less. And overall, we can see that here because we can see that in the past year, the volume of retail trade, i.e. the amount of things we've bought rather than the amount we've spent, fell 0.6%, okay? Now, that's down, but okay, we've got to remember that we've had population growth, so we should be spending more, right? And so if we factor in population growth on a per capita basis, we, each of us, yourself, myself, your families, spent 3% less in April, May, and June, this year versus same time last year. So what this shows is it's not excess demand that's driving inflation. Okay, and so that's a positive, right? Because what that indicates is that further jacks up in the cash rate are not really going to solve this issue then, because we've known for some time it's not been purely a demand-driven inflation issue. There has been supply-side factors at play as well. Now, he does make a really nice point that, look, while inflation will move up and down over the months and it'll be quite choppy, if you zoom out, you can see patterns. And if we zoom out, the pattern we see is roughly inflation is coming down as quickly as it went up. And we can see that here, right? It's gone up and it's coming down, and there's a really nice parallelism there, which indicates that the underlying is probably, as we've indicated with the trim mean, moving in the right direction. Now, in saying that, though, why is it that we're still seeing some sticky inflation? Whether or not we're looking at the annual, all CPI, or we're looking at the trim mean, there's still an element that's clearly sticky. And so what we want to look at here is what are the 12 biggest contributors to inflation? And what we can see is that they're largely what's called essential or non-discretionary. So, new dwelling purchases, rents, tobacco, fuel, insurance, right? Electricity, tertiary education, secondary education. These are things that ultimately you have to keep spending on. It doesn't matter if they're costing more. As a household, you need to keep spending. And so as a result, further cash rate increases are not necessarily going to also enable households to sort of dial back on these items and really, therefore, maybe reduce some of the demand pull inflation we might be seeing here. And so as a result, you can see that the prices on all discretionary items, excluding tobacco, rose just 2.8%, where the cost of essential items rose 4.5%. So you can see that there's a real tension point here for households. Now, note, you can see here the data across the US, Canada, and Australia with inflation, and this is months before and after the peak, okay? And this is fascinating because you can see that, Australia is perhaps, at a point where, if we compare it to the US and Canada, at roughly the 16 to 18 months past the peak, right, they're really started to see that sort of drop. And so the point here is perhaps if we look at global experience, we're at the cusp of inflation starting over the next quarter particularly to fall even more. Now, one final comment here is about the conflict in objectives. The RBA needing to try to maintain full employment as well with the inflation target because they've now got a dual objective, but also just managing that because we've also then got the worsening distribution of income and wealth that can come with rising unemployment. Now, Ross Gittins has a great piece here, particularly looking at some briefing notes that the Australian Council of Social Services have provided. They're the peak welfare organisation across the nation, and they're really looking at how can we support people who are unemployed, don't have work, and are struggling in terms of on the poverty line. And one of the things that they highlight is that look, things are a lot worse than they look, right? And we highlighted that last week when we looked at the unemployment data as well. Okay, they identified that a number of vacancies for entry-level jobs have declined by a third. There's an additional 100,000 people unemployed and almost as many, another 100,000 that are suffering underemployment. Okay, while it looks like employment is growing, most of that is occurring in publicly funded jobs, i.e. the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And so therefore, what we're seeing here is that a market sector is struggling. It's shrinking in terms of employment, it's going backwards, and the concern there is it will drive potentially worsening income distribution. So there we have it. Okay, I think a complex situation with inflation right now, but some really great data that you can use in your essays around your analysis. For those of you that have trials this week, all the best in your trials. Hope you level up those essays and unlock that Band 6. If you have any questions in the lead up to your trials, leave them in the comments below. I'll do my best to respond. Otherwise, see you in next week's episode.